Leviticus 14, let's call this one poor because it is dealing with yet another part of the sacrificial system that makes a distinction between rich and poor, making sure that the poor do not have to endure unnecessary stress in making their offerings. This being the part of the cleansing laws that deal with the cleansing of leprosy. And poor seem to stand out to me in three ways. One, you didn't have to be poor to get leprosy, but there was a provision for the poor that did. And then finally, looking at Jesus' relationship to leprosy, we'll see that he was a poor conductor of a lot of the things that made leprosy such a dangerous disease. First and foremost, most of these offerings are going to have to do with what seems to be almost every type of offering we've seen to this point, except the peace offering. Verses 12 and 13 are going to invoke the guilt and sin offerings. And then down in verse 20, it's going to invoke the burnt offerings and grain offerings. And the stories of lepers in the Bible don't always describe them by name. But of the named lepers in the Bible, the three that stood out to me were Gehazi, servant to Elisha, Miriam, Moses' own sister, and King Uzziah, all three of whom seemed to overstep their bounds, or at least the bounds of their authority. But only one of them could even be potentially interpreted as poor, and that's Gehazi, because he was actually a servant, even though he was a servant to a man of status. And his leprosy did attach to the fact that he tried to get money in a situation where his boss, Elisha, had healed for free. And so understanding that, looking at Miriam overstepped the bounds of her authority when she spoke against Moses' wife in a time when it seemed that God had no problem with who he was marrying. And then finally, when we look at the last one, Uzziah, king of Israel, or really Judah, the southern kingdom, after he became prosperous and successful, tried to extend his kingship into the priesthood where he did not have authority to offer sacrifices. And so understanding that really seems to tie back to what we saw in chapter 14, where a component of the offering for healing of leprosy were, among other things, the sin and guilt offerings. But then fast forwarding to what we see in Jesus, one of the things that some folks will correctly emphasize is when he cleanses a leper in both Luke and Matthew's Gospels, he's going to go one step beyond simply saying, I'm willing to heal you, and he's going to touch the man. And for some reason, that touched me, and understanding that that's a gesture. Sometimes in life, we can just feel untouchable. And when we see a situation where somebody is winning, sometimes we can just feel a vicarious win through somebody else, even if it's not going so well for us. And there we have a story where from time to time, I guess I feel like I get a vicarious win, even though I've never necessarily suffered with leprosy. I've had bouts of eczema over my life. And so there's certain passages that just touch different ones of us in different ways. And so that's one who, even though I didn't necessarily have it to that degree, I could appreciate God's willingness through Jesus to literally touch the man and encourage him beyond simply healing. But one of the things to understand about Jesus and the poor title that we chose is that Jesus was a poor conductor for the leprosy. And so when Jesus touched him, one of the things we're seeing is the buck stopped with Jesus, meaning the disease wasn't going to contaminate God. God was going to show his dominance and his control and his authority over the disease. But more importantly, the sin wasn't going to stick to Jesus. And so to the degree that any of these diseases were connected to sin, that sin did not have authority over God. And so the question for us is this: there are materials like plastic and glass that are poor conductors of electricity. And understanding that Jesus was a poor conductor not only of leprosy, but of any underlying sin associated with it, the question for us becomes, are we, even if we can't heal leprosy, going to be poor conductors of toxic behavior? Understanding that life is full of opportunities to be provoked by either mean words, petty conduct, so on and so forth. You don't have to live very long to understand that the next provocation is right around the corner. And the question for us is, are we going to do what the Bible says when it describes growing into spiritual maturity, not allowing provocation to dictate our response? And so to the degree that glass and plastic and similar materials are poor conductors of electricity, my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that we learn to be poor conductors of toxic type provocation, finding a way in God to simply be emotionally mature enough to reprocess it into something, God willing, more productive. His best to you as you go forward in him, though.